discuss discuss how wages are determined in a perfect market for 12 marks. Then the B part to this is, if the labor market is imperfect, is the determination of wage rate still better left to that market? Okay, now let's get started here, right? So first thing that I want to tell you that in labor market, there could be two possible scenarios. So either there could be perfect labor market or there could be imperfect labor market. Now let's first understand what's the difference between perfect and imperfect labor market, right? When we say perfect labor market, what we mean is that we have a lot of firms that are willing to hire labor and there are a lot of people who are willing to work, right? So just think about what happens in a perfect product market, right? So just like there's a perfect product market where there are a lot of firms producing the product, and then there are a lot of consumers who are willing to buy that product. Similarly, in the perfect labor market, you have, right? So there are some characteristics that hold true, right? So let's first, just give me a second, I need to get this setting right? So there are, okay, characteristics of perfect labor market, right? So firstly, what you need to understand is that there are a lot of firms that are willing to hire labor, right? And there are a lot of sticks of perfect labor market, right? And there are a lot of people who are willing to look for jobs, right? Perfect labor market, right? So the first one is a lot of firms willing to hire people, right? Firms willing to hire, and many people who are looking for work or applying for jobs, right? To hire, and many people finding work, looking for work. Okay, then the second thing is that each firm in perfect labor market has to accept the wage that is prevailing in the market, right? So let me give you an analogy over here, right? So just like in product market, where in perfect competition, you would remember there used to be this idea of price taker, right? Similarly, in the perfect labor market, firms are wage takers, which means that whatever wage is prevailing in the market, they have to sell, they have to provide the same wage to their workers, right? So firms are wage takers. Abdullah, at any point, if you find anything confusing, you have to ask me, right? So firms are wage takers, which means whatever firms are, I'll show you with a graph as well, wage takers just give me a second, I mean this, I'm struggling with firms are wage takers, and so they have to hire labor at the wages that are prevailing in the market, right? They have to hire labor at the wage rate prevailing in the market. Wage rate prevailing in the market. I'll show you with the help of a graph, so you don't need to worry about it. Prevailing in the market, right? So far we have talked about two characteristics of perfect labor market, right? So the first one is that there are a lot of firms that are willing to hire labor, right? So what is labor market actually? So labor market is about connecting firms which are demanding labor and connecting people who are willing to get hired, right? So demand and supply of labor, right? So just like any other product or any other service, labor also has demand and supply. But who demands labor? The firms who want to hire people, right? And who supplies labor? The people who are willing to get hired, right? So that's it is. Now, the first thing that you need to know for perfect labor market, that there are many firms willing to hire and many people willing to work, right? So it's not, few companies, and similarly, there are not few people, right? So there are a couple of different firms that are willing to hire, and there are a couple of different people who are willing to get hired. Then the second thing is important here, that firms are wage takers and they have to hire labor at the wage rate prevailing in the market, right? Now, what does that actually mean? I'll show you in a bit with the help of a graph, so you don't need to worry about it. Then the third point is that labor has homogeneous skill set. Labor has homogeneous. What it means, you might have heard the word before as well in perfect market or perfect competition when you talk about homogeneous products. Similarly, here you are saying that labor has homogeneous skill set, that every person more or less is similar when it comes to the work. I mean, no one is more skillful or less skillful. All people that you find in the market are equally good, right? So if you want to hire, let's say, a photographer, or if you want to hire a teacher, so all teachers are more or less equally competent, capable. Similarly, whatever you think about, right? Whatever occupation, if similarly you have to hire a doctor, each doctor is equally good, equally competent. So that's what homogeneous means, right? Same. Homogeneous literally means same or similar, no difference, right? Same or similar, no difference. Okay, then that's another thing. Why is that important? You'll get to see, right? Then another thing is that labor is occupationally and geographically. Labor is occupationally and geographically mobile. Now I'll tell you what this means. Now, what does occupationally means? Occupationally and geographically. What is an occupation? So any line of work that you're involved in is your occupation. So I teach, I'm a teacher, right? Someone who's a lawyer would be his occupation, and so on, right? A doctor, engineer, and so on and so forth. So these are our occupations or professions, right? Now, what it says here, that labor is occupationally and geographically mobile. Mobile means being able to move, right? Able to move. Now, what do we mean by that? Now, we are assuming that if there is someone who's a doctor, otherwise occupationally, but that person can switch from being a doctor to an engineer. I mean, which is kind of hard to imagine in real life, because being a doctor requires one type of degree and being an engineer requires another type of degree. So how much possible would it be for someone to convert or to switch his occupation? But we are assuming a very ideal world. We are assuming an ideal world where people can switch occupations, right? And we do see sometimes, right, being people do change their occupations initially. They get degree in one field, but they do something else for their living, right? So they join some other type of career or occupation, right? So labor is occupationally mobile, meaning that they're able to switch from one career or one occupation to another. And geographically mobile means that they can switch between cities, right? They can move from one country to another, one city to another, right? So that they don't have to stay stuck. So it's not that if someone is born in Islamabad or if someone is born in Karachi, so they have to live their entire life over there, right? They have to work over there. They can go to other cities, find work. They can go to other countries and find work, right? Is it making sense? Right? So that's very important assumption. Why so? I'll tell you in a bit. Okay, now think about this. Let's sum this up, Abdullah. So there are two types of markets when it comes to labor market, right? There will be two scenarios that we'll talk about. So one would be a perfect labor market where certain assumptions will hold true, which I've written in front of you. I'll show you with the help of a graph as well. And then in the same question, the B part talks about imperfect labor market. So we'll also we'll also talk about that in detail, right? So this is a good question, as we'll get to talk about both the perfect and the imperfect market. Okay, now perfect labor market is where certain characteristics hold true, the ones that we just listed down. So we'll go and look at that, and then we'll come back and talk about imperfect market, right? Okay, now for the perfect labor market, there are four characteristics that hold true. Many firms, right? There are many firms that are willing to hire and many people looking for work, right? So there's a lot of supply, a lot of demand. That is how you need to understand this. So this first point says a lot of supply, right? Because many firms mean that there are a lot of firms demanding labor. A lot of demand and supply, right? Is this making sense? A lot of demand and supply, right? Good on this. Okay, now moving next, the firms are wage takers. Now what it means, you'll better get to understand when you look at the graph in a bit. But Think about this. Just like any other market, wages are based on demand, market demand for labor and market supply, right? So where the market demand for labor will equal to the market supply of labor, that will be the equilibrium point, and that will be the market wage. And then one firm out of that, right? I'll give you a specific example. One firm out of that has to hire labor at that wage rate. Now, let me give you an example. So in fact, let's talk about this as we move forward. Now, think about this. If you think of teachers, how many different places could teachers work? Right? How many different places could teachers work? Is it only schools, right? Right? Where can teachers work? What do you think? Right? So teachers can work in obviously schools, but nowadays teachers also have the option of working online, right? Working for some online teaching platform or online teaching startup, right? And things like that. If you count the total number of, if you count the total number of schools in any city, let's talk about schools and online teaching platforms for now, right? So if you add up all the number of schools and all the number of online teaching platforms, right? So that will together determine the demand for labor. And this will be defined as market demand for labor. Are you getting me? So this downward sloping demand for labor is market demand for labor. Why? Because it's not just the demand of labor, not just the demand for teachers by one school like Head Start or let's say Beacon House or City, right? But it's the demand for teachers by all schools in that city or in that area collectively. Is this making sense? Abdullah, right? So what happens that where the market demand for teachers is equal to the market supply of teachers, that is the equilibrium point. Market supply of teachers, that's the equilibrium point, and that will determine the market wages. Market supply. And who will determine the supply? I'll show you individually as well, but right now I'm just giving you the bigger picture so that you can understand. So who will determine the market supply? Think about this. Who supplies labor? The people themselves. So if I'm a teacher, if I'm a qualified person and I'm qualified to teach, then I'm determining the supply. But I'm not the only one in the market who can work as a teacher. There's so many other people in the market who can work as teachers, right? So we together are determining the supply. Now, where the demand and supply of labor intersects, that will be the market equilibrium point, right? That will be the market equilibrium point, and that will show us what? That will show us the equilibrium wage, right? That on average, how much would each teacher be paid? That will show us the equilibrium wage. And if you connect it to the x-axis, that will show us equilibrium quantity. That will show us equilibrium quantity, showing that how many teachers will be hired, in the market. So this is equilibrium wage, WE, and this is equilibrium quantity, which means what is the total number of teachers that will be hired in the market, right? Easy. So that is what the perfect labor market looks like. Now, think about this. What is this wage? Let's assume a number. Now, let's say each teacher per month on average is paid, let's say 50, 60, whatever, right? So let's say whatever this amount is. Now, let me ask you this question. If I'm running a school, or let's say I'm running an online teaching platform, right? Mega Lecture, we are running an online teaching platform. Now, if the market wage is 60,000 rupees per month, Abdullah, listen to this carefully. If the market wage rate is 60,000 rupees per month, my question to you is, can I hire any teacher for Mega Lecture at any wage less than 60,000? If I pay more than 60,000, I mean, that would be amazing. But my question to you is, I mean, people would love to, work from Mega Lecture because we are paying them more than what the market offers. But if in case I want to hire a teacher, given the fact that a typical teacher earns 60,000 rupees per month in any given school or academy, and I want to hire a teacher for less than 60,000. So my question to you is that, would that be possible? Is that even possible or not? Yeah, what do you think? Okay. Are you taking time to think, right? Abdullah, so would I be able to hire? You can write a comment, you can just tell me, right? So this is what the idea of wage taker means. Just give me a second. So the idea of, yeah, sure. Okay, so I was saying, Abdullah, let's say equilibrium wage here is how much? 60,000 rupees per month. That means a typical teacher earns how much? A typical teacher earns 60,000 rupees per month, right? Now, if Mega Lecture is an online teaching platform and Mega Lecture wants to hire a teacher for economics or any other subject, would Mega Lecture be able to hire someone for less than 60,000 rupees per month? Would Mega Lecture be able to hire um, anyone for less than 60,000 rupees a month? That's my question. Not possible. Exactly. Because, yes, exactly. And this is also linked to the idea that labor is occupationally and geographically mobile, right? So, I mean, firstly, they can move between cities and they might not even need to do that, right? So if Mega Lecture is offering less, they know there are a couple of other schools that are offering them at least 60,000 rupees. So they can go and work for those schools rather than to work for Mega Lecture. Are you getting me, right? So the idea is plain simple. That first thing that we discussed in this, that firms are wage takers, right? Now, when firms are wage takers, so the wages are determined based on market supply of teachers, right? And market demand for teachers. Now, have a look at this. Now you'll get the full idea. Now, where the market demand and market supply of teachers is equal, that is the equilibrium in the market, right? So I'll draw two graphs for you, and then you will clearly understand. This is industry, right? So what is industry? Or you can simply think of this as the market. So market is collection of firms. Market is not one firm, right? We do know this, right? So market is collection of firms. So there are 5 schools, 10 schools in the area, all willing to, hire, all willing to hire teachers. So they will together make up the market for teachers, right? So you have wages and then you have Q of T, or quantity of teachers, right? So you have wages on the y-axis and you have quantity of teachers on the x-axis. Now, have a look at this. And then I'll draw another graph to the right of this. And what would be the purpose of this graph on the right? I'll tell you. Have a look at this. Now, another graph that I'll draw to the right would show me an individual firm, right? So on the left graph, I'm showing the market, what happens in the entire market. On this right graph, I'm showing what happens to the firm, right? So what do we have on the y-axis? We will have wages, again, wages on the y-axis, but that is for one firm. And we will have quantity of teachers on the x-axis, just like the other graph, but it will be only for one firm. Okay, now have a look at this. Firstly, what you need to do is you need to show that how much is the market demand for labor, right? So downward sloping is the market demand for labor, sorry, right? So have a look at this. What's the total demand for teachers in the market? That would be MD, right? I'm writing this MD, market demand, right? And then you will have an upward sloping supply, which is the total supply of teachers in the market. So I'm writing this as MS, market supply of teachers, right? Now, where the market demand, market supply equals, that will be the equilibrium point. Do you agree, right? And that will show me how much a typical teacher earns per month. So in this case, we are assuming a typical teacher earns 60,000. Now, what you need to do, you need to extend this line, extend this wage rate to the other graph. And then this is the supply of teachers to one firm. Now, this would be a little difficult for you to understand, but let me explain you what that exactly means. Now, the supply of teachers to one firm or one school is what? It's perfectly elastic. Abdullah, the supply of teachers to that one school or one firm is perfectly elastic. Why? Because there's so many teachers who are willing to work with that company, right? So just like in perfect competition, when there are a lot of firms producing the same product, there could be infinite supply, right? This is known as perfectly elastic supply. So this is exactly the case, right? Because they can go to next alternative, right? So supply of labor to any one firm would be perfectly elastic because there's so many people who are willing to work. And what will be the shape of the labor demand curve? So the shape of the labor demand curve would be something like that. Why it goes a little up and then goes a little down, right? I'll tell you later on, right? So curve, downward sloping curve, is the demand for labor for one firm. Now do remember, do differentiate that this is on the right, it's for one firm, and this graph on the left is for the entire market. So downward sloping is the demand for labor, which goes initially up and then down, and the supply of labor is perfectly elastic, right? Now, where the demand and supply of labor intersect, right, you bring this down, and that would be the quantity of labor hired by one firm, right? So let's say one firm, Mega Lecture, is hiring 10 teachers during a time, whereas the total number of teachers hired in the market are how much? The total number of teachers hired in the market are, let's say, 100 or let's say 200, whatever it is, right? But one firm out of those 100 is hiring 10. Is this making sense, Abdullah? So that is this entire concept of firms as wage takers. This is the entire concept through the graph that I just explained to you, that firms are wage takers. Whatever wage is prevailing in the market, whatever the wage rate is prevailing in the market, at that wage, each firm has to acquire labor, right? Because if you pay them something less, as I just told you and as we just discussed, that no one will want to work for Mega Lecture, because obviously they're not stupid. Why would they come and work for us when they can work for more in some other place? Okay, is this clear now? I'm assuming this would now make more sense. Right, and this curve, the demand for labor is your marginal revenue product of labor. So this is basically the demand for labor is always MR, marginal revenue product of labor, MRPL. Exactly, absolutely, that's correct. Very nice, right? So the two characteristics were many firms willing to hire and many people looking for work. The second characteristic of perfect labor market is that firms are wage takers and they have to hire labor at the wage rate prevailing in the market. The third one is that labor has homogeneous skill set, right? So you do not differentiate between people because each person is equally good, right? Same or similar skill set. And the last one that we discussed is that labor is geographically and occupationally mobile, right? Exactly. And MRP, marginal revenue product of labor, is basically marginal revenue and times marginal product of labor, MPL, marginal product of labor. Exactly. Correct. Correct. That's correct. Right? Okay. Now let's come back to the question and then let's see what exactly the question was asking us to discuss. Discuss how wage rates are determined in a perfect labor market. Now, this is exactly what you need to explain. Okay. Now let's get down to the question. Now, in this, you will also need to explain the demand for labor. Now, have a look at this. Discuss how wages are determined, wage determination in perfect market, right? This is what the question asks us to discuss. Wage determination in perfect labor market. Okay, now have a look at this. Now, firstly, you have to explain, you can start off, what I usually do is that you can start off by listing the characteristics, the 4 characteristics of perfect labor market that I mentioned. You can start off with that. Why? Because upfront, you are giving the examiner the idea that you know about what perfect labor market is and what characteristics should exist for labor market for it to be defined as perfect, right? So you will quickly go on to mentioning the 4 characteristics of perfect labor market. Then you will say that now the next thing that you have to do is to define what is demand for labor and what is labor demand and what is labor supply, because until unless you don't explain what is labor demand made up of and what is labor supply made up of, right, you can't really explain that how the wages will be determined, because as we just saw that wages are completely dependent on these 2 factors, right? Market forces, as we say, the demand and the supply. Okay, now let's come to the demand side first. Right? Now, what is labor demand? So labor demand is basically, now you'll get a better idea that how you will go about this. So labor demand, Abdullah, is made up of marginal revenue product of labor. Now, what is marginal revenue product of labor? Let's define this in detail, and all of this needs to be written in this question. So marginal revenue product of labor is the additional revenue that labor generates, that one more unit of labor generates. Marginal revenue product of labor is additional revenue that one more unit of labor generates for the company. Now, the way we calculate this, I'll also write the definition for you to understand. That is, have a look at this. Delta meaning change. That is change in revenue due to change in labor. So it simply means if you hire one more unit of labor, how much will be the increase in your revenue, company's revenue? Okay, now think about this. Another thing that we already know, Abdullah, that marginal revenue product of labor is made up of, as you rightly said, it's made up of marginal revenue, right? Times what? Marginal product of labor. Now let's try to understand these 2 points, right? So what is marginal revenue? Marginal revenue is the change in revenue due to production of one more unit of the good. How much price, right, or how much revenue would an additional unit of the good get your firm? How much additional revenue your firm will get by selling or producing one more unit of the good? That is your marginal revenue. Easy, right? So change in revenue and change in output is your marginal revenue. Simply speaking, the change in revenue due to production of one more unit of the good is our marginal revenue. Now, what is marginal product of labor? So marginal product of labor talks about physical quantities. What do we mean by physical quantities? That how many additional units of good, right? How many additional units of good would each additional unit of labor produce? How many additional units of good, which means change in output due to change in labor? How many additional units of the good, which would each additional unit of labor produce, right? Now, think about this. Now, knowing this, any confusion so far? I'm not writing down the definitions. I'm assuming that you would know, but if you are confused, you can ask me, right? So marginal product of labor, yeah, go on.
Sir, aati hai, continue.
Okay, perfect, great. Now think about this. Now, one thing that you need to understand, which you would know already, that marginal product of labor is always diminishing, right? So marginal product of labor diminishes, which means that each additional unit of labor would produce less. In fact, let's put it down like this. Initially, right, increases, and then initially increases and then decreases as more units of labor are hired. Units of labor are hired. Okay, now think about this. Now the idea is that, let me give you an example, right? Just to internalize, or just to, remember this example more clearly. Okay, now on the left side, I'll write units of labor, right? Then on the second column, I'll give you total product, right? Then on the third column, we'll find, marginal product, right? And then we'll do marginal product, and then we'll have price slash marginal revenue, and then we'll have price slash MR, marginal revenue, right? And then last of all, we'll have marginal revenue product of labor, MRPL. Okay, now have a look at this. Now what we're about to do here is we are about to get an idea as to what the shape of the demand for labor curve would be, because that's based on marginal revenue product of labor. So we are about to calculate marginal revenue product of labor, right? So have a look at this. All right, let's take a little up. Okay, now have a look at this. Now let's assume you hired the first unit of labor, right? And the total product was 10. Then you hired the second unit of labor, second employee, and your total product, the total output that the company produced, went to 25. Then you hired the third person and your total output increased, but the addition was, let's say, uh, you know, the total output increased to 35, right? Then you hired the first person and your total output increased to 40. And then you hired the fifth person and your total output rose to 44. Okay, now have a look at this. Now, total product is the total output that a company produces with first unit of labor, then with 2 people, then with 3 people, then with 4 people, and then with 5 people. Okay, now have a look at this. To calculate the marginal product, what we do, we have to take the difference, right? So the first person on his own, what is marginal product? This is marginal product of labor that I was talking about. So this is the one, right? So the first person on his own produced how much? The first person on his own produced 10 units of the good, right? So I'll write 10 over here, right? The second guy on his own produced how much? So this, to calculate that, how much did the second guy produced on his own, what you need to do actually is you have to subtract 10 from 25. So the second guy on his own produced 15 units of the good. The third guy on his own produced how much, right? So 35 minus 25, the third guy again produced 10 units of the good. The fourth guy on his own produced how much? So 40 minus 35 would be 5. And the last guy on his own produced how much? 44 minus 40 would be 44 minus 40 would be 4, right? Now, what did you observe? Initially, the marginal product increased from 10 to 15, but then it fell off again from 15 to 10, and then from 10 to 5, and then from 5 to 4. Easy, right? So that's what you need to remember. Okay, now this is another important thing to remember. Now, what is the price or marginal revenue? Now you have to listen to me carefully, Abdullah. If it's a perfect product market, if this is a perfect product market, which in most cases it is, so it's perfect labor market and perfect product market, which means perfect competition. If you remember what used to happen in perfect competition, each unit of the good sells for, in perfect competition, each unit of the good sells for same price. Yes or no? Do you remember this, right? That each unit of the good, because the demand curve for perfect competition, I'm talking about perfect, is perfectly elastic. The demand curve for perfect competition is perfectly elastic, which means that each unit of the good would sell for exactly the same price, right? Yes or no? So that being said, the price of the good, each unit in the market. So let's say if this label is producing, I don't know, footballs, or let's say t-shirts is the better example, right? So if this labor that you're hiring is hiring for the clothing industry, right? Clothing factory, and they produce t-shirts. Now, let's say each t-shirt sells for 500 rupees in the market. How much does it sell it for? Sells for 500 rupees. So that sells for 500 rupees. So price is always constant. That doesn't change. This is per unit, price per unit, right? This is 500 and this is 500 and so on. So you fill the entire column with 500. Now, what do you need to do next? As we just saw that the marginal revenue product of labor is product. So how do we calculate this? By multiplying these two things. Now, when you do that, so it would be 5,000 for the first guy. So the first guy on his own produced 5,000 units of the good, right? Then the second guy, 5,000 rupees revenue for the company. Then the second guy, 15, that would be, I guess, that would be 15 times 500 would be 7,500, right? So the second guy generated a revenue of 7,500 for the company. The third guy generated revenue again worth 5,000 rupees for the company. Then the fifth guy produced a revenue of 2,500 for the company. And then the last of all, the fifth guy generated only a revenue of 2,000 rupees for the company. Now, what is happening? Now, when we plot these values, on a graph, that is what will give us the labor demand. Are you following me? That will give us the labor demand, right? So you'll have wages on the y-axis, right? Or yeah, so you have wages. Why am I writing wages? I'll tell you in a bit, but you can write it down like this: wages slash MRPL, right? So marginal revenue product of labor. And then on the x-axis, you will have obviously quantity of labor. Now, what you need to do, quantity of labor or quantity of whatever, right? Teachers or whatever, right? Okay, now if I just start plotting these values, now the first guy was, have a look at this. The first guy was right here, somewhere here, right? 5,000, right? So the first guy was generating a revenue of 5,000 for the business, right? So this is one and this is 5,000, right? Then the second guy, second, this was the first guy. Then the second guy generated a revenue of how much? 7,500, as we saw, right? So the second guy generated a revenue of 7,500. Then the third guy was again generating a revenue of 5,000. Yes or no, right? And then the fourth was something less. The fourth was, I guess, 2,500. Yeah, 2,500, right? And the last one was, right? The fourth was
2,000, sir.
right, and 2,000, right? Are we getting this? So the idea is you can see for yourself that with addition of more units of labor, what is happening, just like there's diminishing marginal utility, right? Like each additional unit of the good gives you less utility, less satisfaction. Similarly, each addition of labor, right? So if you connect it neatly, it would go something like this, right? That each addition of labor would give you less marginal product. Each addition of labor to the company would give you less marginal product, and therefore, your marginal revenue product of labor would fall. Right? Are you getting? Because this is staying constant. And why is this staying constant? I told you the reason why your price or marginal revenue is staying constant, not always it stays constant, but when the product is being sold in perfect competition, so whatever the price of the good is, right? So if each shirt is being sold for, let's say, 500 rupees per unit, then it would stay fixed at that. Nothing more, nothing less, right? Right? But what is decreasing? This marginal product of labor is decreasing. Each additional unit of labor is producing less, and therefore the revenue that you generate eventually is less. So initially it rises, it goes up, and then it goes down. Okay, now coming back to the main part. So we started this entire discussion to explain that what demand for labor is. The labor demand, we said, is made up of marginal revenue product of labor. What's the formula? It's the change in revenue due to change in labor, right? Then what is marginal revenue product of labor actually made up of? It's made up of marginal revenue. It's made up of marginal revenue and marginal product of labor, right? Now, what is marginal revenue? Additional revenue due to one more unit of good. Then what is marginal product of labor marginal product of labor? So change in output due to change in labor, right? When you multiply these two variables, you'll get marginal revenue product of labor. Then I made this, table to explain you in detail how this works, right? And one final thing that you need to remember is that, in fact, that was correct. Sorry, my bad. So since your marginal product of labor initially increases and then decreases as more units of labor are hired, that is the reason, since this initially increases and then eventually decreases, that's why your marginal revenue product of labor also initially increases, as we just saw with that example, initially increases and then decreases. Is it making sense? Initially increases and then decreases, right? Okay. Now, this being said, this was the marginal revenue product of labor for one firm. Abdullah, this is the most important point I'm about to tell you. Now, this was the marginal revenue product of labor for one firm. So we have just seen the demand curve for one labor, right? One firm, sorry. We have just seen the market, not the market, demand for labor by one firm. Demand for labor by one firm, right? Now, the next thing that you need to know, that market is not made up of one firm. Obviously, market is collection of firms. Market is what? Market is collection of firms. Now, if we add up, listen to this carefully, if we add up the demand of labor from all these individual firms, so if we add up the demand for labor from all these different firms, then that would give us what? That would give us the market demand for labor. Are you getting me? So let's say if this was the demand for, labor, who produce t-shirts in a factory, right? But there are a couple of, obviously in the market, there will be a couple of firms that are willing to, produce shirts and looking for such type of labor. So if you add up the individual firms' demand for labor, that will give you the market demand for labor, right? Now, for the sake of simplicity, I will assume, for the sake of simplicity, right, Abdullah, I'll assume that these are straight downward sloping curves, right? Because then, I mean, we can add up the other type of graphs as well. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm assuming that these are just straight downward sloping curves, right? Straight downward sloping curves, right? Now think about this. That let's assume three firms, right? There are three firms that are demanding labor, right? So the first, right, D3, D2, and D1, right? Is this clear? Okay. Now, what you need to do to find the market demand for labor, you need to add up these three. Now, you need to add the demand of labor by these three individual firms. And how you do that? Now, this is interesting. Have a look at this. So you'll choose a random wage rate, right? And then you'll see that at that wage rate, how much labor would be demanded by W, firm 1, firm 2, and firm 3, right? So let's say the first firm wants to hire 10 employees at this wage. At the same wage rate, the second firm wants to hire, let's say, 15 employees. And at the same wage rate, the third firm wants to hire, let's say, 20, 20 employees. So 10, 20, 30, 30 and 15 is how much? 45. So the total demand for labor in the market at this wage rate would be how much? The total demand for labor at this wage rate will be 45. Similarly, you can choose another point, right? You can choose another wage rate, let's say W2, W3, whatever it is, right? And then you can, right? So let's say this is W2, and this W2, how much you want to hire, let's say 8 units of, right? By the first firm, the second one is, let's say, 12, and for the third firm, it's like that, right? So you just add these values up, right? And that will tell you that what will be the demand for labor in the market, right? So 17 or 18, right? So 18 and 12 is 30, 30 plus 8 is 38. So the total demand for labor at this wage rate would be 38, right? Easy. So that would be 38. So the downward sloping, right, demand, again, the market demand would also be downward sloping, something like that. But this is not for one firm, but this is demand from all individual firms. So this is market demand for labor. Is it making sense? Right. Yeah, sure. So let's stop here for today. Abdullah, we'll continue from here. So we have just explained the first part, right? Since the question was asking about that how wages determine the perfect labor market. So obviously you'll not write in that much detail in the actual exam, but you do need to explain that what's marginal product of labor and what's marginal revenue product of labor. So we'll explain all those things. So we have covered the demand side of the labor. Tomorrow we'll talk about what makes up the supply side of labor, and then we'll finalize this up, right? Okay, so I'll see you tomorrow then. Take care and have a good night. Allah Hafiz.